Welcome to New Song Radio. We're beginning a new theme, Jesus. We will discuss what he's not known for and what he is known for, his celebrity, so to speak. We will talk about his humanity, his divinity, his declaration of identity. What did Jesus say about himself? And finally, how should we respond to his majesty? However, before we start the next theme, we want to discuss with Pastor Olu-Ayeni some questions that have come up about our previous series on worship. Pastor, I found the series on worship very interesting, and I was particularly struck by Mary and Martha. And when Jesus came to raise Lazarus from the dead, how they both told him that their brother had died, and if he had been there, he would have lived. Yet you pointed out that when Mary made the comment, Jesus wept. And you made the point that it was the difference in the relationship that Jesus had with Mary versus Martha that accounted for his tears. And so I think for me, the fundamental question is, as I read through the stories and I read through the New Testament, help me understand how, as a follower of Christ, I can be like Mary.
Okay. That is the question I think we all should ask. Where to start? Well, I guess the simplest answer to that question is to be a person of worship and adoration. But it takes a little bit more than that, because in order to be a person of adoration, you have to be a person of intimacy first with God, someone who knows God intimately, which is not built in one day. That's not something that happens overnight. So Mary did not come to arrive at this point in one day in her walk with the Lord, with the Master. And I did mention in the teaching various examples where Mary is mentioned, and she's mentioned as being at the feet of Jesus. When Jesus came into their home with about 70 disciples and Martha was serving, Mary was at the feet of Jesus listening to him. Again, in a posture of worship and adoration. In John chapter 11, which you just referenced, when she came to offer her prayer, she came and fell at his feet. In John 12, after Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead and they were hosting a dinner in his honor, she again was at the feet of Jesus. So this is not a relationship that happened overnight. This is something that was built with time spent in intimacy and abiding in him and fellowship and just building that relationship over time. And I think that's the easiest way, I guess, we could get to where Mary was, which is just by building our intimacy with God on a daily basis, where we are not always just coming at God with prayers, God, do this for me, do that for me, but we take the time to pull back every so often and just fall at his feet and say, Lord, you are our Master and our Lord,
So you talk about building a relationship with God and take the time to fall at his feet. Tell me more about practices or things that one should do to build that relationship. But I think some of us, we read our Bible, we sing, but we don't have a sense of his physical presence. So what does it mean to fall at his feet when he's not here in human form? And what does it mean to build the relationship?
Okay. First, I think it's important for us to acknowledge and realize the reality that God is a person. This is a reality that I think eludes many people. We see God as this giant computer program in the sky where you plug in prayers and you receive answers from, or not. But we have to come to the realization that God is a person. That's I think the first thing. The second thing is, if he is a person, then we have to come to the realization that there are things that please him and things that don't please him. And like any other person that you or I know, and like you yourself, there are just certain general principles that apply. For example, if I have a friend who always has something good to say. I'm more inclined to be open to that person than someone who always has something bad to say. That's just a natural inclination, because we're people created in God's image. So his personality is reflected in us in many ways. And so we see that. We generally enjoy being around people who celebrate us than people who endure us. Everybody likes to be celebrated. Nobody really likes to be tolerated. So when we read in scriptures that God inhabits the praises of his people, instead of super spiritualizing that, we should just relate that to how we would be as human beings as well. As people, we like being around people who celebrate us. And that's the same with God. If you celebrate God, if you express your love to him, if you're proud to be associated with him, the chances are that God will be near you. His presence will be near you. He will want to be around you. He will want to camp around you. So that's what we see in Mary. We see someone who is lost in her adoration for the master, and then we see him respond. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very helpful answer. It really brings a lot of clarity to how to develop that intimacy. You used the word adoration a couple times. In another part of the teaching, you talked about what it means to adore God. And you described adoration as acknowledging him for who he is. I think I got this right, not necessarily for what he's done, but for who he is. And I found myself thinking when you said that, well, I know a little bit of him, but I'm relatively new to Christianity. And so I'd just like you to elaborate on that, what it means to acknowledge him for who he is when there are many aspects of him, many ways he's described in the word that you may not have experienced on an individual basis.
Thank you. That's really a very relevant question, because our adoration of God, or our ability to adore God, is directly proportional or equivalent to our knowledge of him. And I think during the teaching, while I was teaching at church, I had said to us that it's possible to thank God without really knowing him intimately. And it's even possible to praise God without knowing him intimately. But to worship God in adoration without knowing him intimately is not possible. Just like if a young man goes up to a young lady who he doesn't know, and they have no prior relationship, and he just begins to adore her, she might get really spooked and think that he's a creep. She might not be so comfortable with that. And I think I gave us an example on one of the teachings where if you were to approach my wife in church and say, "Oh, thank you so much for everything you do. You're a wonderful pastor," she'd be okay with that. And if you praised her even and said, "You're such a great host," and so on and so forth, she might be okay with that. But if you started to adore her, she might become really concerned about what's going on here. And that's how it is with our relationship with God. We couldn't adore him beyond our knowledge of him or our intimacy with him. And so, to answer your question, yes, there is no way to separate two. Intimacy with God is fundamental to our ability to adore him. And if we want to adore him more, then we need to grow in our intimacy with him and in our relationship with him. And there are various ways in which we could do that. And I think one important way is by asking, "Lord, I want to know you more." Praying about it more and saying, "Lord, I really just want to know you more. Reveal yourself to me. I want to experience you more. Help me to experience you more."
All right. That sounds like a good prayer point. You've talked about Thanksgiving as a key aspect of worshiping God. And in one part of the teaching, you mentioned Matthew Henry. And you talked about how he had been robbed, and you gave him as an example of being very thankful because he noted a couple things. He noted that even though he had been robbed, he didn't have much. So he was thankful to God that what he had wasn't much, and they took it all, but it wasn't much. You noted that he thanked God that though he had been robbed, his life had been spared. So he was thankful that his life had been spared. And you also noted that he thanked God because he was not the robber.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I thought, wow. When I think of Thanksgiving, I always think of my standard is if it's out of the ordinary, extraordinary. And what you've described here is somebody who's thankful for absolutely everything. And I just would like for you to talk a little bit more about what it means and why we are to be thankful. Essentially, it sounds like for everything.
Yes, it's a fascinating story, and I tell that very often, especially when it comes to the matter of Thanksgiving and happiness, because both are a matter of perspective. So two people, and I said this also during the teaching, two people could be experiencing the same circumstances, and their approach to the circumstances would be different because of their perspective, how they view what they're going through. And the Word of God calls on us or instructs us as believers to change our perspective of things so that we begin to see God in everything. And this is a matter of practice. It's something that requires us practicing it. No one arrived at Matthew Henry's perspective by accident. It doesn't happen like that. For example, in the current crisis we're going through in the nation and in many nations in the world, the coronavirus pandemic, when I lead the church in prayer and I say, let's give thanks, if you look in the midst of the situation, there are pockets of mercy here and there that you could observe and be thankful for. For example, the fact that the virus is not resistant to soap, it's not resistant to disinfectants or disinfecting alcohol. That's a pocket of mercy, because if it were, then it'll be a much bigger issue. There are other pockets of mercy, like the fact that there's so much communications network now. Previously, if this happened even just 20 years ago, it would have been much worse, because we don't communicate as often or as freely in the world as we do now. But now the world's able to communicate. If something is happening in Italy, if something is happening in Zimbabwe, we can know in less than 30 minutes, all over the world, and actions can be taken. That's a pocket of mercy. People being locked down with their families who would not otherwise have the time to spend with their family because of work. That's a pocket of mercy. It's a matter of perspective, how you view what you're going through. Do you view it as God being with you there? And if you view it as God being with you there, then you will see positives even in a negative situation. So to arrive at the perspective of Matthew Henry is something that takes a lifetime of practice. And I think it starts with a decision that I want to be a thankful person. From that flows everything else. You become deliberate about it, yeah.
Okay. That's also helpful, and it's good to know that it's the kind of thing that's a practice, that one can make the decision and over time can achieve greater levels of thankfulness and making that part of your daily life. You also talked about giving as a key aspect of worship. And I noted that you mentioned that when you give to the poor, you've done a favor for God, and you distinguish between giving to the poor and giving to things of God. And I found that very interesting, because I guess I probably had it in my head that giving to the poor was a requirement, something that Christians are required to do, something that am I my brother's keeper, so to speak. And so I would like it if you would talk a little bit more about how we should be thinking about giving to the poor versus giving to the things of God, and how that fits into our worship.
Okay, so Proverbs 19:17 says that he that gives to the poor lends to God. When you give to the poor, God considers it a debt. And I think that's a grace from God, because it's really our responsibility. But if God says, if you give to the poor, I owe you, that's a grace that I think we should be thankful for. God says, I'm going to remember this. I'm going to owe you for that. And it is our responsibility, by the way, as believers. We are supposed to give. The Word of God says in Matthew chapter 6, when Jesus is teaching his disciples various things, he says, when you pray, taking for granted that his disciples will pray. He says, when you fast, again, taking for granted that as a believer, you will fast. He also says, when you give alms, taking again for granted that that's something that you would do as a consequence of being a believer or being a child of God. So yes, you are right. That is something that is consequence of being a believer. Our compassion for the poor, for our compassion for the needy, is something that cannot be separated from being a child of God. That's standard, because you cannot say that you love God if you don't love your fellow brother or sister. The area of demarcation between that and giving to God or to the work of God or giving to church or to missions, there's a difference in approach. When you give to the poor, you give out of compassion and pity, mercy for them. And then when you do that, God says, I owe you one. But when you give to God, you don't give out of pity, because you're giving to the one who owns everything. So when my parents come to visit us, my parents are mostly based in Nigeria, but they're retired and they're business owners, so they travel often. And very often they come visit us. Whenever they come visit us, we do our best to host them and to keep them compatible with the standard of life that they're used to, okay? My parents-in-law as well, same thing. And when they're about to leave, I put together a gift, like some money in an envelope, or a gift card, or a check, or something, and I give it to them. Now, my parents, at this point, they're worth a lot more than I am, okay? So they don't really need my money. It's just a token of honor and appreciation. I'm thanking them for coming, and I'm just giving this as a token of honor. They don't need my money at all. Now, if I gave it to them with an attitude of giving to someone who needed the money, then I would have insulted them. And the whole point of that giving would have been, overridden. And that's exactly the concept that comes to play here when we give to God. And when we give to God with this perspective as though we're giving to the poor. When we're giving to the poor, we're giving to the poor. And Jesus said to that disciple of his, Judas, he said, you have the poor always with you. Go take care of them. Okay? But that's different from what this woman has done to me. This is a token of honor. And when we give as though we're giving tribute to a great king, which is exactly what we're doing. So there is a difference there.
That's a great explanation. And I really appreciated your making the analogy with the way you treat your parents. It helps to put it in perspective. One of the other points you made, and I think this may be my last question, is that we must worship in truth and in spirit. And in talking about worshiping in truth, you were particularly careful to say to us we should be careful about what we sing in our worship. And you gave some examples. I think you used a song where one of the verses is, I surrender all. And as I listened to that, I thought, most of the Christian music that I'm familiar with has verses like that. It's about giving your all to God. And I know that as a Christian, that's something I'm still working on. And so I found myself wondering, is it wrong for me to sing a song like that? How do I determine what's appropriate to sing in worship?
Thank you. That's, again, very good question, and a very relevant one for the times that we're in. The thing with when we come to the place of worship, praise, thanksgiving, adoration, is that we do have to be careful about what we are offering God, as with anything else. When you sing a song, you want to consider the lyrics carefully and make sure that the lyrics you're singing, first of all, are representing what it is you're trying to offer to God. So, for example, when we sing songs that don't offer any thanksgiving, okay, and I know this isn't your question, I'll come to your question. When we sing songs that don't offer thanksgiving, that don't offer praise, and that they don't offer adoration to God, it's okay to sing those songs, but we shouldn't tag them worship. Okay, we can tag them prayer songs, we can tag them songs of inspiration or encouragement. But when we say we come to worship or time for song worship in church, and we sing some of those songs, we're just going through the motions. We're not really thinking about what we're doing. We're not really being deliberate about what we're offering God. And that was the sin of Cain. He wasn't deliberate about what he was offering God. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that even when we are offering songs that are songs of adoration or songs of praise and of thanksgiving, we should still consider the lyrics to be sure that what we're offering is truthful. And I did make an example of a song that says, I surrender all to you, withholding nothing. That's a great song. But to most, that's more of a song of prayer than it is a song of worship, because very few people are actually there yet, where they have surrendered everything to God and they're withholding nothing. So it would be untruthful to sing that as a song of worship, but more relevant as a song of prayer. And it is okay to sing it as a song of prayer. However, if you claim to be singing as a song of prayer, then the attitude that you're presenting at the time when you're singing that song should be a prayerful attitude, not a neglectful or laissez-faire attitude of, you couldn't be singing that song while scrolling through your phone or whatever. That's a song where you're genuinely saying, Lord, I want to surrender all that I have to you, and I want to withhold nothing from you. So that's where worshiping in truth comes into play. Another practice is when we sing songs that address God as He rather than you. If you walked up to someone and you started to sing to the person, or say to the person, she's beautiful and she's great and she's the best, the person might stop you and say, "Wait, are you talking to me or are you talking about someone else?" And so when we say sing songs that have He rather than you, there's nothing wrong with those songs, but we must be aware of what we are doing, that we are singing to people, telling them about Him. Okay? Bow down and worship Him. Enter into His presence, and so on and so forth. We are singing to the people and telling them. So we shouldn't close our eyes, wave our hands, and pretend like we're singing to Him when we're singing those songs. That shows a neglect of the lyrics we're singing or we're presenting. We're not being deliberate. Things like that. They may seem very little here and there, but they're important things where God is concerned, because God is a person.
Thank you. Again, very insightful answer. One more question. You did mention Cain and the mistake he made in the offering that he made to God. And I know I've read that story a couple times, and you talked about it as Cain wasn't deliberate. The term to describe Abel's offering was firstling. And I thought that meant Abel gave God the best. And I found myself wondering what the relationship is between deliberate and the best. So if I think about it, but I still don't choose the best, have I done what I'm supposed to do in making my offering to God?
Understood. So there are two things that I said we should consider every time we're giving God something. One, that it must cost us something. And secondly, that we should think about what we're giving or offering God. It must be deliberate about it. When we are deliberate, but it still costs us nothing, then we're not giving an offering that is compatible with the majesty of God, which you could never really do, but representative of that. So when I give my parents a gift and say, "Here you go, Dad and Mom," if I gave them, say, $100, okay, and my parents know what I'm worth, that could inform their reception of it, because they might say, "Why are you giving us $100 when you're worth so much more? Is this a metaphor for something or something like that?" And if I'm not worth that much financially, they might take that and say, "Oh, that cost a lot for you." That shows a lot of honor, and they'll receive it from that perspective. But I was deliberate either way. So in the same vein, when we are deliberate in our offering to God, if we give Him something that costs nothing, then He responds to us in that way, in the sense that you have given me something that doesn't cost you anything, even though you are aware of my majesty. And I think that's even worse than not being deliberate, because you're deliberately insulting God.
Yeah,
So,
I think that would be worse.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your insight. I always gain such a greater understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ when we talk. So thank you, Pastor.
Thank you, Terry.
So we want to make sure that if you have questions, please know that you can put them in the comment section. We'll be taking a look, and we'll make sure that the pastor answers them in the next interview.